The town of Wellingford had always been quaint, a quiet village tucked away in the rolling hills of England, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets were few. But under the serene streets and cozy cottages, there had always been whispers of something darker, tales passed down in hushed tones about old rituals and a shadow that lingered at the edge of the woods. On a fog-laden evening in late October, a body was discovered in the abandoned chapel at the edge of town, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood. Detective Inspector Evelyn Clarke had seen many gruesome crime scenes in her career, but the sheer ritualistic precision of this murder sent a chill through her spine. The victim, a young woman named Lillian Moore, was found kneeling before a crude altar of blackened candles, her skin etched with strange symbols, her lifeless eyes staring at an unseen entity above. Nearby, pages torn from an ancient book of spells lay scattered, their edges burnt, the ink smeared into ominous sigils. Evelyn's breath caught as she realized this was no ordinary murder, it was the handiwork of someone who understood the dark arts, someone who had weaponized superstition into a methodical killing. The town's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour, the whispers evolved into panic, neighbors locking doors, candles lit in windows not for decoration, but protection. Families whispered prayers and children were warned never to wander after dusk, the fear palpable as though the town itself held its breath. Clarke and her team began their meticulous investigation, documenting every detail, photographing the altar, analyzing the peculiar symbols, and interviewing the shaken townsfolk. The local library, normally a haven of calm, became a center of dark research as historians and occult experts were brought in to decipher the ritualistic markings. Each symbol hinted at summoning or binding, a power meant to dominate or destroy, and Clarke could feel the weight of generations of superstition pressing down on her as she pored over texts that were centuries old. The victim's history revealed her fascination with occult practices, though never harmful, merely curious. Had she stumbled into something far beyond her understanding, something that someone else exploited? The detective could almost feel the malevolent presence in the chapel, a sinister energy that seemed to cling to the walls and linger in the air, cold and suffocating. Each officer reported a sense of unease, the hairs on their necks standing, unexplained shadows flickering in peripheral vision. Local gossip began blending with terror, stories of cloaked figures in the woods, chanting in strange languages, and hooded gatherings that met under moonlight. Forensics uncovered more horrifying evidence, a circle drawn in what appeared to be a mixture of soot and dried blood, markings perfectly measured and intricate, suggesting not only obsession but expertise. Every angle of the crime scene pointed to intentional terror. This murder was designed to send a message, to instill fear, to show control. Clarke felt the enormity of her task, knowing that catching someone who could combine occult knowledge with homicidal intent required both intellect and courage. Outside, the village reacted in ways that were unsettling. Shops shuttered early, dim lanterns lit pathways, and conversations were replaced by silent glances and whispered warnings. Children clutched their parents' hands tightly, too young to comprehend the depth of evil, yet instinctively aware that the world had shifted. Families with long-standing roots in Wellingford recalled past legends, the very folklore they had once dismissed now manifesting in terrifying reality. Each night, the fog seemed thicker, the shadows darker, and the sound of the wind carried a haunting resonance as if echoing the chants from unseen corners. As days turned to nights, a pattern emerged. The murders were not random. Each killing coincided with phases of the moon, the placement of candles always meticulous, the symbols increasingly complex, revealing an evolution in the killer's rituals. Clarke traced the symbols to an ancient coven that had been rumored to operate in secrecy for centuries, hidden among the population, leaving traces only when necessary. Interviews with local elders uncovered fragmented stories, disappearances decades prior, inexplicable deaths, animals found mutilated with ritualistic precision, all pointing to a sinister tradition that had never been fully eradicated. The detective felt the line between superstition and reality blur as each layer of the case peeled back. Whoever was responsible was not only calculating but steeped in belief, a practitioner of dark arts using murder as both sacrifice and statement. The atmosphere in Wellingford became suffocating, the town paralyzed by fear. Shops closed earlier, streets emptied, and an unnatural quiet settled, broken only by distant howls from the surrounding woods. Clarke spent hours examining possible suspects, Yet every lead felt like a ghost, someone skilled at hiding in plain sight, blending with the innocuous. Interviews yielded terrified testimonies, neighbors recalling glimpses of hooded figures disappearing into forests or shadows that moved independently of human form. The detectives' team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing historical records, library archives, and local folklore, trying to identify connections. Each discovery revealed only more questions, the shadow of black magic looming larger with every clue. The town watched, waited, and whispered, and Clarke realized that this investigation was as much about uncovering a hidden history as it was about solving a present-day murder. The first part of the investigation ended with more questions than answers. Lillian Moore's death was only the beginning, a message that something ancient and malevolent had reawakened in Wellingford. Clarke knew that uncovering the truth required venturing deeper into darkness, risking not only her career but potentially her own safety. The town's energy had shifted, superstition had merged with reality, fear had taken root, and every shadow carried the weight of possibility. Outside the walls of the chapel, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, whispering secrets of rituals and sacrifices, a grim reminder that the nightmare had only begun, and that the darkness of Wellingford was far from vanquished. Wellingford was no longer just a quiet village, it had become a town gripped by a pervasive sense of dread. After Lillian Moore's ritualistic murder, whispers of a hidden cult spread like wildfire through cobblestone streets and ivy-clad cottages. Detective Inspector Evelyn Clarke had spent sleepless nights poring over symbols, tracing their origins, and questioning townsfolk, but the case was evolving into something far more sinister than she had imagined. The evidence suggested that the murders were not random acts of violence, they were ritualistic sacrifices, carefully orchestrated by a secretive cult that had survived in the shadows of Wellingford for decades, if not centuries. The symbols etched into the victim's skin were not mere decoration but signs of devotion, dark marks intended to summon or appease an unseen, malevolent force. Clarke could feel the weight of every generation of superstition pressing upon her as she consulted with occult experts, cross-referencing ancient texts, looking for patterns that might reveal the killer's next move. Each discovery was more chilling than the last. The second victim, a local antiques dealer named Marcus Halloway, was found in his shop 3 nights later. The scene was even more macabre than Lillian's. Black candles encircled him, their wax melted into grotesque shapes, and a series of intricate symbols had been carved into the wooden floorboards beneath his lifeless body. A black feather, perhaps from a crow, rested upon his chest, a silent marker of the cult's presence. Clarke walked into the shop, the heavy scent of burnt incense clinging to the air. She felt a shiver run down her spine, not only from the macabre spectacle but from the palpable aura of something unnatural. Surveillance footage from the nearby streets showed fleeting shadows, hooded figures gliding past lamplights with almost inhuman grace. Witnesses spoke in hushed tones of chanting that echoed faintly at night, from deep within the woods, from places no one dared enter. Every clue pointed to an organization that was not merely committing murder, they were performing sacred rituals according to a dark, unwavering code, blending murder with occult devotion. The town's response was one of fear and superstition. Residents avoided venturing out after sunset, leaving windows tightly shuttered, doors bolted, and lights burning through the night. Parents clutched their children closer, whispering prayers over them before bed, warning them against venturing too close to the forest's edge. Clarke understood their panic, she had seen it herself. The line between reality and the supernatural seemed thinner in Wellingford than anywhere she had ever worked. Reports from terrified townsfolk hinted at hooded figures disappearing into the woods, chanting in languages no one understood, leaving behind traces of ritualistic paraphernalia, feathers, burnt pages, and blackened candles. Each item carried its own horror, its own story, and Clarke meticulously catalogued them, aware that every artifact was a piece of the larger puzzle. She could feel the cult's presence closing in, like a shadow enveloping the town, and she knew that the murders were not just about killing, they were messages, each more intricate and terrifying than the last. Clarke delved deeper into Wellingford's history, unearthing tales of ritualistic sacrifices dating back centuries. Elders recounted stories of villagers who disappeared without explanation, of animals found mutilated in precise patterns, of dark symbols scrawled in the mud during midnight ceremonies. These were not merely legends, they were the roots of a tradition that had survived quietly, hidden from authorities, and only resurfaced when the conditions were right. Clarke realized that the cult had adapted over time, evolving its rituals to blend seamlessly with modern life. They used fear as a tool, leaving enough evidence to terrify but not enough to allow capture. Each act was calculated, each murder a demonstration of power, control, and devotion to their dark beliefs. The psychological toll on Clarke and her team was immense. Walking through crime scenes, examining symbols, and feeling the oppressive aura of ritualistic violence left them with an unease that lingered long after leaving the locations. Clarke often found herself staring at shadows in alleyways, seeing figures that weren't there, hearing whispers that faded when she tried to focus. The town itself seemed alive with fear, the streets quieter, the fog heavier, and the wind carrying eerie murmurs that hinted at secrets buried deep within the woods. Every night, Clarke returned to her office, reviewing files and photographs, connecting dots that might lead to the cult's core, but the deeper she dug, the more she realized the cult's reach and cunning. They were methodical, patient, and almost always invisible until the final horrifying act. The second part of the investigation introduced an unsettling revelation. The cult appeared to have members embedded in the town itself, individuals living ordinary lives by day, practicing malevolence by night. Every neighbor could be a potential threat, every familiar face a hidden participant in the sinister practices that had haunted Wellingford for generations. Clarke was faced with the impossible task of distinguishing friend from foe, trying to predict where and when the cult would strike next. The murders, while horrifying in their immediacy, were part of a larger, more calculated plan, a sequence of dark rituals that hinted at an endgame Clarke could only speculate about. The fog seemed to thicken over Wellingford, the darkness growing heavier, and each night brought a sense of urgency. Catch them before the next ritual, before another life was claimed, before fear became permanent. As Part 2 closes, the town of Wellingford has shifted from quaint and calm to a place suspended between fear and suspicion. Clarke stands at the threshold of the woods, the place where cult gatherings were rumored to occur, flashlight in hand, every rustle of leaves and snapping twig amplified in the silent night. The weight of centuries of superstition presses down, and she knows that the murders are not just acts of crime, they are a confrontation with something darker, older, and more malevolent than she has ever encountered. Wellingford's shadows are alive, its secrets breathing, and the detective understands that the true horror is not only in the murders themselves but in the terrifying possibility that the cult is watching, waiting, and planning its next ritual. The next chapter of this story promises an even deeper descent into darkness, where fear, murder, and black magic intertwine in ways that will challenge everything Clarke believes about crime, morality, and the supernatural. The air in Wellingford was heavier than usual, thick with fog that seemed to cling to the cobblestones and seep into every crevice of the town. Detective Inspector Evelyn Clarke had spent countless sleepless nights following the trail of ritualistic murders, tracing symbols, interviewing terrified townsfolk, and piecing together the cult's intricate and horrifying patterns. The town, once quaint and charming, had transformed into a labyrinth of fear. Windows were tightly shuttered, candles flickered in every home as wards against evil, and whispers of cloaked figures in the woods had become common conversation. Each ritual, each murder, had been designed not only to kill but to terrify, to assert control, and to feed the cult's dark purpose. Clarke had come to understand one chilling truth: the final ritual was approaching, and if she did not intervene, more lives would be lost, and the cult would complete its most sinister act yet. The victim this time was someone who had inadvertently crossed paths with the cult, a local historian named Thomas Redford. His interest in Wellingford's dark past had drawn the cult's attention. Thomas had been following a series of cryptic diaries from the 1800s, which described ceremonies of summoning, binding, and sacrifice. The cult had learned of his investigation, and their response was swift and deadly. Clarke arrived at the scene as night enveloped the town. The room was dimly lit by black candles, their flame flickering and casting dancing shadows on the walls, which were covered with ancient symbols smeared in a mixture of soot, ash, and blood. At the center of the room lay Thomas, lifeless, his body positioned within a carefully drawn circle of sigils, a crow perched silently atop a nearby beam, as though observing the culmination of the cult's malevolent work. Every detail screamed intention. The killing was more precise, more symbolic, and more terrifying than the previous murders. Clarke's stomach turned as she documented the scene, the oppressive energy pressing down on her like a physical weight. Clarke's investigation had now reached a critical juncture. Evidence suggested that the cult operated not only in secrecy but also with careful planning, choosing victims whose deaths served a larger ritualistic purpose. The murders were sequenced to coincide with lunar cycles and certain astronomical alignments, an occult calendar that dictated their actions. She reviewed every clue, the symbols etched into victims, the timing of the murders, locations tied to ancient sites, and objects left at the crime scenes: feathers, candles, burnt pages from arcane texts, all pieces of a ritual that spanned centuries. It was clear that the cult believed in an ultimate, transformative ceremony that would grant them power, influence, or supernatural authority. Every minute Clarke spent analyzing the patterns brought her closer to understanding the dark ritual's schedule. The final act was imminent, and Wellingford itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the culmination of evil. The town's reaction intensified. Residents avoided even familiar paths, avoiding streets and alleys where shadows seemed thicker. Shops closed early, and the streets were deserted long before nightfall. Children slept with lights on, adults whispered prayers, and families gathered to guard each other. Clarke understood the psychological impact of the murders. The cult's goal was not merely killing but instilling terror, breaking the town's sense of security, and feeding off the collective fear. The detective prepared herself mentally for the confrontation, knowing that she could not merely follow evidence. She needed to anticipate ritualistic behavior, predict where the cult would strike, and intervene before the final victim fell. Each night, she walked the alleys alone, flashlight in hand, attuned to the smallest sounds: the rustle of leaves, distant footsteps, the echo of a chant carried on the wind. She felt that the cult was aware of her presence, a malignant intelligence observing, waiting, and planning. The night of the final ritual arrived with a sinister calm. Clarke and her team moved carefully into the outskirts of the forest, guided by anonymous tips and forensic traces linking the cult's past murders to a hidden clearing. Fog swirled around gnarled trees, and the faint glow of black candles illuminated the clearing in unnatural hues. The cult was already assembled, robed figures forming a circle around an altar, murmuring in a language foreign and ominous. At the center of the ritual was the intended victim, bound and terrified, the culmination of centuries-old rites about to unfold. Clarke signaled her team silently, but she knew confrontation would be delicate. Any misstep could provoke violence or disrupt evidence crucial for prosecution. Every sense was heightened: ears straining for the cadence of chants, eyes scanning for movement, muscles tensed for action. The oppressive air seemed to thrum with energy, a dark anticipation that made every heartbeat loud in the stillness. The confrontation was inevitable. Clarke stepped into the clearing, shouting commands, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. Some cult members scattered, disappearing into the fog, while others resisted, chanting louder, attempting to complete the ritual despite her presence. The scene became chaotic, a blend of fear, adrenaline, and raw, ritualistic fervor. Clarke's team restrained the cultists as they tried to continue, the final victim freed just as the last chant reached its peak. The clearing was filled with smoke, black candle wax, and the scent of burnt herbs, all evidence of centuries-old occult practices. Clarke breathed heavily, aware that though the immediate threat was neutralized, the psychological and historical depth of the cult's crimes would haunt the town for years. The investigation would continue, legal processes would unfold, but Wellingford would never forget the terror that had passed through its streets. As dawn broke, the forest seemed quieter, almost unnaturally so. The fog lifted slightly, revealing trampled grass, scattered candles, and the remnants of symbols etched into the earth. Clarke looked around, reflecting on the magnitude of the case. The murders, rooted in black magic and superstition, had reshaped the town, leaving an indelible mark on its collective consciousness. Residents would continue to light candles at windows, tell stories to children, and whisper warnings long after the arrests were made. Clarke herself would carry the weight of the investigation, a reminder that evil can persist in shadows, and that some rituals are designed to endure beyond the acts themselves. The dark ritual of Wellingford had ended, but its echo would resonate, a testament to fear, superstition, and the deadly consequences when ancient beliefs intersect with human malevolence.